An ode to Tony Petrella. But first, let me say, the way I deal with change is that I have lived in the same place for 45 years. So those chimes in this deck have been with me. And now to Tony. Well, Tony is just one of the greatest founders that we have in the field. He and I are from Minnesota. He comes from the Iron Range. And he had an accident there just recently. He fell off his new sailboat and hurt his ribs and never recovered. He and I were in conversation with each other, and I was curious why he hadn't responded to my phone calls. So we both enjoy the Minnesota lakes. Here in Lake Minnetonka for me, where I don't sail, I just go out with my speedboat and I just sit and I meditate. Just float. You can't meditate when you're running a sailboat. It takes too much concentration. I first met Tony in San Diego Organization Development Network Conference 74 or 75. It was the one where Jack Gibb was and Barry Oshry. And I befriended Linda, his wife, before she even met him. She had just joined Palo Alto as the OD person for the city, and so came to the conference. And I introduced her to the world of OD personally. And I believe it was the first time she ever saw Tony then. Then, let me tell you about ESSO. I have Tony starting the first internal organization development function, probably simultaneously with Shel Davis of Digital. And his report was Peter Block, and they brought in all the consultants from NTL, Beckred, Argyris, Shepard, and so forth, and they consulted Tony. And that process has been sustained because ESSO morphed into ExxonMobil, and Rick from Abadesco from the Philippines went from San Miguel in Manila to work with Tony and brought back then what he learned. And San Miguel now is the longest internal OD function outside of the United States. So Tony has had a great influence. And we've asked Tony to keynote the Asian Organization Development 2018. Rick has, and I have. And so maybe more about that later. Tony's strengths. Number one of the most effective. What do they say? If you can't do OD, you teach. Well, if you can't run effectively an internal executive function, then you become a consultant. Tony was so effective running ESSO's internal OD function. And then he was so effective running, I believe, the most effective, successful OD consulting firm of the late 60s, 70s, maybe 80s, Block, Petrella, and Meisboard. Tony ran that. Why, Block did all the fun stuff, and Marv did all the fun stuff with the clients, but Tony was the Gibraltar, Rock of Gibraltar. And Tony also then ran the Organization Development Network for, gosh, many, many years. He was the second director following my friend Warner Burke. And it was the best times of the OD network because Tony knew how to design conferences. Then the next highlight of my life with Tony is the Pepperdine MSOD program. Tony was what we called an FOB, a friend of Pat Williams. And Pat Williams came from UCLA with Bob Tannenbaum, and Tony was involved in the planning of Pepperdine. And then he became a consistent, wonderful adjunct consulting person to the program and a faculty, and he was in my Delta class. And his course was team building. And so I built my phase 1 of my WST three-phase whole system transformation approach with Tony's consultation. And I haven't changed it since because it's right. Every time I change it, it isn't as good as it was. So Tony's strength, again, I say, was design. Okay? Then this past year, I emailed Tony and didn't get a response. I think he connected with me on LinkedIn. But then he doesn't do emails or much stuff. He's just in Happy Land, retired with Linda, enjoying sailing. But he does answer his cell phone. And so we had many cell phone conversations. And he agreed to keynote the Asian Organization Development Network coming up in Cebu, run by our president, current president, Rick Abadesco, who studied with Tony years ago at ExxonMobil and Esso. And so we're still trying to work that out. But maybe here's a side note. Tony shared something that was very significant. That he and Linda moved to Carmel for about a month every year. And then Linda and Tony and Bob and his wife would have a sensitivity training session periodically for 2.5 days. And that was his highlight of his life. And no doubt helped him change with Bob, who is one of the greatest, as we know, Bob Tannenbaum, one of the greatest. I want to do a special video for him someday. I've got his last message to you on tape and in my book. So let's talk about Tony's values, his strengths. First of all, he was effective, one of the most effective. Number 2, he had a self-deprecating humor. He was egoless. He could make fun of himself. But he was always present, and then deeper present. So important in my WST, internal change agent person. We must be present. We must deeply listen. Okay? And then he had courage. In very subtle ways, he knew how to hit the bullseye, how to hit the target, to create giant waves and not get stuff ricocheted back to him. And then the new global framework, that Don Cole and I created from ODI and now in ISOD, has become the global framework at National Organization Development Network with Sherry. And the first 2 major pieces are Tony's strengths. Number 1, enterprise-wide change, or I think it's called systems change. But Tony says, where's the O and OD? I think he's stealing that from Beckert. But then he continually was the best at designing. I mean, he helped Pat Williams design somewhat the Pepperdine program, I think. But he designed the conferences. He designed interventions that were just flawless for Block, Petrella, and Wiseboard. That's one of the reasons they were so incredibly successful. Tony was behind the scene. And now let's end up quickly. Tony also agreed to keynote Agent Audio Network. So maybe we can get Linda to come and tell the story. And we'll dedicate that to him. And I want to thank David Knorr, because I sent him an email because there were some missing pieces. Somebody said he graduated from Pepperdine, and David and I don't think he did that, because we were right there from the beginning. We would have known. But just a side note to David Knorr, who helped me prepare this. He has the best book on OD out right now, because it's his thesis under Peter Vail way back when he got his PhD, and then he's retranslated it into today's world with relevancy, and it's so on target. So, as they say in the UK, cheerio and joy to the world for Tony's life. There's no sadness in my life, in my thinking of Tony. I celebrate his joy. He was at such peace in his last years. He was in such joy with Linda in his last years.